Hello, welcome to agile-devops-east, and welcome to this talk on test orchestration, integrating test automation into DevOps. First of all, hello, I'm Coty Rosenblath. I'm the CTO of Katalon. Katalon is a software company specializing in the development of tools for automated testing. You may know us from our Katalon Studio product, and we have a whole platform of testing tools to help you automate and orchestrate and optimize your testing. I won't be talking much about our products specifically today. We'll have some screenshots, but those are really just to illustrate abstract elements of my talk. So what is my talk going to be about? Well, it's going to be about how testing fits into DevOps. And specifically, we're going to talk just briefly about what is DevOps. I think we all have a good understanding, but I think it's good to ground that. Talk about where testing fits into DevOps, how it's important to DevOps. Talk about how test automation, just like so many automated elements of DevOps, is critical to success there. Then I'm going to introduce the notion of test orchestration as a layer on top of automation, coordinating automation that we believe is really needed in order to get the most from your test automation within your DevOps pipeline. And I'll talk a little bit about our Katalon Test Ops product, but again, mostly in the context of how it addresses test orchestration and how features in Test Ops align with test orchestration. Along the way, I'll be referencing a few statistics from a study that we did and published in our Continuous Testing Navigator for 2021. And I've got a link to that document here. You can come back and copy that down later. It's easy to find on our website, and it will also be available in our virtual booth here at Agile with DevOps. So feel free to drop by our booth, ask for that, ask for any other information that might come up while we're talking today. So with that behind us, let's start out with what is DevOps? We're at a DevOps conference, so I think everybody knows, but I do want to take some time to just ground ourselves. And you can pause to read here, but the things that I want to pull out of here in particular are that although I'm going to talk today about tools and practices primarily, DevOps is not just about tools and practices. It also incorporates philosophies. I'm not going to dig into that today, but I don't want to overlook that. And I think there'll be other people better at that than me talking about that at the conference. I also want to pull out the focus on speed and the movement within DevOps to accelerate the delivery of software to our customers, deliver value to our customers so that we and they can compete more effectively in the market. Because I think that acceleration, that speed, is really what drives a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. As I said, I'm not going to delve into sort of the philosophical, social topics of DevOps in an organization, but I will talk about some technical capabilities and some processes. And not surprisingly, the one that I'm going to pull out is continuous testing. You see it here in this list that I pulled from the Dora website of some key technical capabilities underlying a successful DevOps environment. And in addition to continuous testing, I will probably touch on some other elements and how they interact. Things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, may even speak a little bit to test data management. But they all work together. But today's topic will be focused on continuous testing. So going back to that acceleration, I want to use this chart to talk about why DevOps is so important now, why testing, test automation, and test orchestration are so important. This is a chart pulled from the white paper that I mentioned earlier. And it shows here that the majority of the respondents, and we had about 2,000 some odd practitioners surveyed, people at all different levels, including both quality professionals and development engineers, including teams of various sizes. Anyway, what we pulled from that was how often are they deploying? And what we found was the majority were deploying more than daily. So daily or hourly, and hourly really meant multiple times per day. And even, going down, you can see the tail is really in the beyond monthly. Once you've taken weekly, daily, and hourly into account, you've really taken the vast bulk of teams. And that is dramatically faster than we have delivered software historically. And it's only, accelerating over time. So I think that discussion of accelerating delivery times does a good job of setting up the importance of DevOps, why DevOps has become a requirement for any successful software organization today. I think that takes us to the question of why test in DevOps and where does testing fit? And I found myself really fortunate to run across this tweet from Jez Humble, who I imagine everybody here knows. And it actually came out after I'd already selected this topic and was working on this. But I think it does a great job of setting up this discussion. You can stop and read. I'll read a bit. So Jez says, it's come to my attention that many people think continuous delivery deployment is about taking whatever stuff you have in version control and shipping it into prod as fast as possible so that you can test in prod. Jez contends that that is not the case, and that continuous delivery is about making it safe to ship your code into prod. And I love this setup because while I agree and have talked about the need to test in prod in a modern environment for most organizations, because it's increasingly difficult to replicate everything in staging environments, particularly scale for internet scale companies. At the same time, I think Jez is dead right about the fact that there is still a place for testing prior to prod. And I'd argue even in prod, there's more to do to test in prod than just shipping whatever you can. That gets into observability and maybe more than we can talk about today. But with that setup, I flipped to another tweet within the thread from Jez, and he says, running many kinds of comprehensive tests fast and continuously so that you can find problems before you ship is key to being successful. And he goes on to mention other key elements, creating a fast deploy process, working in small batches, and gets into some of the not tooling based topics of evolving your processes, your socio-technical systems, so that you can detect and remediate prod incidents and learn from deploying into prod. And again, that's more than we can talk about today. But I'm going to focus on this running many kinds of comprehensive tests fast and continuously. How we can do that, how we can do it better. And we do that, of course, because I think we all know that testing often is a bottleneck in software development. As we build more elaborate, more complicated, more interconnected systems, and we have this increasing demand for that type of software, we need to deliver faster, but we've got more to deliver. Manual testing certainly can't keep up with that. We're going to talk about automation, automated testing, how that can help. And then we're going to flip over into why even automation isn't enough and why orchestration needs to be layered in on top of that. And I think that's critical because that bottleneck has real implications, both the bottleneck for manual testing and the bottleneck that I will show occurs even with automated testing. And that means those implications are lost business opportunities, the inability to scale up your software delivery, your product. You've got longer release times. You've got costly test operations. And you've also got errors slipping through because, in particular, manual testing, is unable to be precise. We're humans. We just can't keep our eye on every detail all the time. So with that setup, that takes us into test automation. And let's talk about what that is. So that brings us to test automation. And, again, I'll briefly sort of set some context for us in terms of what is test automation. I think everybody has a pretty common understanding. It's writing software to test other software. And whether that's using Appium or Selenium or Cypress or Katalon, it's about driving an application. Maybe it's a web application, a Windows application. Maybe you're just driving APIs in your application. It's also, not just that front end, end-to-end automation, but it's also all your unit tests, all your integration tests, using various frameworks, usually open source, things like JUnit, et cetera. But that's what we're talking about. In terms of what we automate, I think everybody's familiar with the testing pyramid, in particular the test automation pyramid, the fact that we strive to have a broad base of unit tests that are relatively independent, not coupled to a lot of infrastructure, can run quickly, and then we layer on top of that service tests, integration tests. Finally, at the top, we've got UI tests, things that test the application as the user experiences it. And that's where Katalon has spent most of its time, and that's a lot of what you see in our studio product, but we also test APIs, and we can integrate in with other unit testing frameworks. One thing that I think is worth talking about, and it harks back to Jez's observation about having a broad suite of tests executing continuously and quickly, is what we see teams automating. And again, some of these numbers are coming from our white paper. And what I've shown here is sort of a progression from some newer, let's say, less mature teams to more mature teams in terms of where they're focusing their test creation. Early on, not surprisingly, it's the things that are relatively easier to test: unit tests, integration tests. Not as much time automating functional tests because they may not have the tools in. They're setting their foundations. And not much non-functional testing. Again, there's things they need to cover before that. As we move into sort of an intermediate, skilled, mature team, we start to see less focus on unit tests, more focus on integration tests, more focus on functional tests, tests that go from the front end to the back end, things that replicate the user experience. And we start seeing a little more non-functional tests. In some of our advanced respondents, what we see is really a more balanced set of tests, and certainly more focus on non-functional tests, which I think is really interesting. I won't delve into it here, but I think that that expansion into performance, security, maybe even accessibility testing, really only makes a bigger case for orchestration, even though I'm not going to dwell on that here. So automation seems great. That is what we've done throughout our DevOps CI/CD pipeline. We've automated builds and deployments. That's been our history. Automated testing seems great. Why do we need to do anything else? Why do we need to orchestrate our tests? And again, I'm going to come back to this thread that I stumbled upon that Jez Humble started, and this response to it, which I think couldn't have been set up better for me. This person, John P., says, 1 year on, we have a pretty decent deployment pipeline, but now we have so many tests that it takes 40 minutes to merge a PR. And I don't think this is uncommon. I know plenty of places I've been have either run into this, ultimately gotten past it, but it's a real problem. You want to build more automated tests, to cover more functions more completely. But as you're adding to that, that's software too, and it's got to run. You've got to find servers for it to run on. It's going to take time. Now you want that to run every time that you have new, underlying software. But now you're creating a new bottleneck, and that's what orchestration is to get us past, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So this brings us all to our ultimate topic of discussion, which is test orchestration. You've built all this test automation. You've got it ready to integrate into your DevOps environment. But how do you manage the many dependencies, the many complexities of your overall test suite execution? And I'm going to say, the test orchestration is a layer on top of your automation that lets you do that. And there are a number of discussions you'll find talking about test orchestration, and not everybody has the same set of capabilities sort of subsumed under this topic. But four that I think you'll see frequently are test management, test planning, test execution, and test analytics. And I'll talk briefly about each of these and how they help you manage your automated testing and improve your DevOps environment. So if we start off with test management, this capability is all about taking the test cases that you've built up, this growing library of tests of various sorts, whether they be unit tests, integration tests, end-to-end tests, and start to organize them into test suites that you're able to use to target specific needs, specific schedules, etc. So for example, you may have a test suite that you build specifically for a release that is focused on just the features that are coming out in that release. That makes sense to run while you're in that sprint, making sure that the things that are supposed to be coming into the functionality of your application are actually working. And you should see that developing over time through your sprint. You may have a larger test suite, a full regression suite that goes over all the functionality of your application, and you may not have the time to run that to completion with every build, but you may want to run it every night or every week. You may have dynamic test suites that are actually not a static set of tests, but tests that fit a certain pattern. You may tag your tests so that you can identify all the tests that, let's say, test your payments API. And if you know that that's changed, maybe it's not even an API that you own, but one that a partner has, and it's changed. There's a new version. You want to make sure that that is behaving the same way. You can pull all those tests together and run them through that suite. You may have a dynamic test suite that grabs all the tests that are failed from the previous test run and runs those at the beginning to make sure that they've been fixed. That's all what we kind of see in terms of falling under the case of test management. And you can see here, this is a screenshot from our test ops product where we also in test management are able to link tests to requirements and defects and organize them that way, evaluate the coverage for tests so that we can decide how they should associate, etc. Once you've got all your tests organized and structured appropriately, the next capability that we think underlies test orchestration is test planning, deciding when a given test suite is going to execute, what the requirements are for executing it. Will it run periodically? Will it run every time there's a change in the underlying repository? Will it run on a simple node for running unit tests? Does it need to run on a node that has a specific browser on it and specific network connectivity because it incorporates end-to-end tests, more comprehensive tests. In addition to that, scheduling test planning should also let you understand how that testing is correlated with your release structure. So, here again, we're looking at a screenshot from our Test Ops product, but really the notion here is that you want to be able to plan your test execution so that they are following your release plan. And by doing that, you're integrating in with your ALM or whatever system is managing that. In this case, we are connected to a Jira system for releases. And then you want to be able to, as I said earlier, take those test runs that you've defined and be able to specify what environment they require. Here you can see a number of test runs, some that have actually executed, some that have a planned execution, and those then are allocated onto environments. So you can see that we've got some tests that require specific browser versions. We've got some tests that can run on a dev server. Those are probably, well, in this case, they're API tests. We've got some tests that are running on a Circle CI environment. And we've got some tests that are actually running on a desktop tester's agent. The notion here in this section of test planning is that all of this is able to give you, as someone who's maybe a director or manager of a testing team, give some insight into what environments you need in order to get your tests executed. And of course, that then leads us into test execution. Test execution is all about actually running those tests. And today that becomes increasingly complicated because you've got multiple browser versions. You've probably got devices that you run on too, because increasingly we have mobile versions of almost every application. And your test execution capability connects your test environment to these execution environments, whether they be, you can see in the icons here, Browser Stack or Sauce Labs or Google Cloud, AWS, Azure, our partners at Katalon for device testing, or Circle CI for more simple development pipeline testing. All of these are capabilities that you may have connected to your environment, but that you need to be able to associate with tests based on the requirements of those tests. And of course, we're executing these tests not just because we can, but because we want to find out things about both the application under test and our tests themselves. And that all takes us into our fourth component of orchestration, the fourth capability of test analytics. When we're wanting to learn about the application under test, the most basic thing we want to know is, what's passing and what's failing. What's working in the application and what's not. And you can see here again in a screenshot from our Test Ops application, an example of tests that have been run over a series of days. You can see both what's passed, what's failed, what has had errors. So they didn't fail, but maybe there was network connectivity that wasn't available, or maybe they didn't have the necessary browser installed, and so you need to update the environment, etc. We can also learn things about how our test execution is connected, importantly, to our requirements. Here you see a report from, again, our Test Ops application showing how our test coverage corresponds to a set of requirements. The things that are red are requirements that have failing tests, and the size of those show basically the number of tests that have failed. So something big in red is something that is failing repeatedly across a number of tests. Something small in green is at least passing, but it may not have good test coverage. And then you've got colors in between. And of course, we can learn more from our tests than just, is our application working or not functionally? We can also learn about how our application is performing. In this case, you see a report on the performance of APIs in an API test. And from there, you can see whether the duration of the API response is highly variable, whether at max it's exceeding your requirements. You could also run an anomaly report to determine, even if it falls within reasonable range, does it fluctuate too much? And should you look into that API? In addition to learning about our application under test, we can learn about our tests themselves in our analytics. For example, here we can see what tests are stale and that they haven't run recently. Those may be tests that we want to consider taking out of our test suite or updating in some way. Likewise, we can see what tests are slow. So not only can we see whether the application is slow itself, but we can see, is a test taking longer than expected, even if the application itself is performing okay. We can also apply test analytics to identifying the most dreaded of test automation phenomena, and that is the flaky test. Here you can see a report from within our test ops application showing tests ranked by flakiness. You can see that these tests, for various reasons, are either succeeding and then having errors or succeeding and failing, pretty much at a random basis, which means they're not giving you much information. And these are tests that you could focus on or remove from your test cycle until you resolve them and make them more reliable, or investigate your environment and see whether some of those failures are the result of environmental issues that you can address. Either way, it's an important thing to be tracking and something that you want to have as part of your orchestration environment. So we just talked about what we think are the 4 key capabilities underlying effective test orchestration. But more broadly, test orchestration is ultimately about connecting your system to a number of different components, from ALMs like Jira, TestRail, and Qtest, so that you can update requirements and defects with test results, to integrating with CI/CD platforms like Jenkins or Circle CI, Azure DevOps, so that you can drive your tests based on events happening in your CI/CD system, to integrating with collaboration systems like the ubiquitous Slack, increasingly ubiquitous Teams, for alerting testers or developers to events that are happening that are related to them. Collaborating through GitHub so that, again, your testers and developers can be sharing code between and amongst each other. Even our own test ops platform, which helps bring together a lot of these systems. And of course, integrating with systems like Sauce Labs for BrowserStack and others for execution environments, Katalon and others for access to devices to test real devices, Applitools and other similar test tools for, in Applitools' case, visual testing, but others implementing things like test impact analysis and more. We'll be seeing more and more solutions in the overall testing and quality environment, and this ability to integrate them into a platform is going to become increasingly important. So that brings us to the end of this talk. In summary, let's just review a little bit of what we talked about. So we started this whole discussion talking about DevOps, what it is, why it's so important today. We identified the increasing pace of delivery that is necessary for us to get value to our customers, how DevOps supports that, and how it's ever increasing in its velocity and its complexity as we have applications deployed that have greater and greater internal capacity and also a greater interconnectivity with other applications to create solutions. We talked then about how DevOps and the success of DevOps is more than just getting our applications from their source repositories into production so that we can test in production. It's about being able to get them into production safely and being able to learn and test and learn about application quality before production and in production. We talked about how testing can become a bottleneck, particularly when it depends on manual testing, because DevOps depends on so much automation that not automating tests means it's bound to be a bottleneck. We then realize that that automation can become a new bottleneck in and of itself. Your success in automation can create enough automation scripts, enough new software for testing that becomes a bottleneck as you try to execute that effectively. That led us to talking about test orchestration and how that can create a layer on top of your test automation where you're able to manage your tests, construct them into test suites that are built and optimized for various functions, plan the execution of those suites across specific execution environments based on activity in your source code, repository, etc. Of course, execute those test suites on execution environments based on the requirements of a given test suite. And finally, perform reporting and analytics based on the results that you've collected from those test executions, and learn from all of that. Learn about how the application itself is performing, what's passing, what's failing, how your tests are performing, what's slow, what's flaky, what is out of date, and how important all of that is to effectively integrating tests into your DevOps pipeline. And along the way, we looked a little bit at Katalon TestOps and how it supports those test orchestration capabilities of management, planning, execution, and analytics. I hope that you've been able to take something away from this. I hope you've learned a little bit. I've enjoyed talking about it, and I hope we can stay in touch. So with that, I just want to say thank you for coming to this talk. It was my great pleasure to put this together and present it. I hope you were able to learn something. If any of it sounded interesting, please come visit our virtual booth where you can get a copy of the white paper that I referenced several times in here. And you can talk to other people from Katalon about our products. You can book a demo online. You can visit our website, and there you'll find information not just about our products, but about testing in general. And finally, please feel free to stay connected with me. I've put my LinkedIn information there. I'm easy to find. My name is pretty easy to Google, and I'd love to hear from you. Take care.